A young mother planned to visit her parents for Christmas, but she never came. Just before the holiday, she stopped getting in touch and disappeared without a trace. Her parents began searching for their daughter, uncovering strange and frightening clues along the way. Soon, the detectives faced an unexpected twist that shocked everyone involved in the case, as none of them had ever encountered anything like that. At the end, this wild twist pushed the case forward and helped them to unravel the truth. Melissa Wolfenbarger was born on September 9, 1977, in the small American town of Locust Grove, Georgia. She was the youngest child in her family, and her older sister, who was 7 years old when Melissa was born, helped their mom take care of her from day one. As they grew up, the sisters formed a really close bond. In high school, Melissa met a guy named Christopher, and soon after graduating, they got married. The couple settled in a quiet suburb of Atlanta, where Christopher landed a job at a glass manufacturing plant. Not long after moving, Melissa got pregnant and they welcomed a daughter, followed by a son a little later. By 1998, 21-year-old Melissa was spending most of her time at home taking care of the kids. Even though she was quite young, she was happy with her growing family. Melissa also tried to visit her parents and sister as often as she could, but with the distance and all her responsibilities, those visits were rare. They planned to spend Christmas with their family that year, and a month before, on Thanksgiving, Melissa called her mom to ask for a special gift. She wanted some old photo of her grandfather. Her mother went through all the family albums, found the perfect photo, and began waiting for her daughter and the grandkids to arrive. But when Christmas came, Melissa didn't show up. At first, her parents were a bit surprised since they'd planned this for over a month, but they figured she might just be too busy. After all, she had 2 small kids to care for, and she'd also recently started working at a cafe because Christopher's income wasn't enough to support the whole family. The situation was complicated by the fact that they couldn't just call Melissa and ask why she didn't come. There was no phone in her house and, back then, cell phones weren't common. Melissa usually called them from her in-laws' house, but since her last call on Thanksgiving, she hadn't reached out once. Her parents decided to wait, but when Melissa didn't call on her mother's birthday, they started to worry something might be wrong. That's when they decided to head to Atlanta to check on her. However, they were met with a surprising discovery. Melissa and Christopher's house was completely empty. After speaking with the neighbors, they learned that the family had moved out right after Christmas, but no one knew where they had gone. This only made her parents more confused. They couldn't imagine that Melissa just moved somewhere else without telling them. Eventually, they got in touch with Christopher's parents and, through them, finally reached Christopher himself. But the whole situation became even more puzzling. He claimed Melissa had left him back in December and he hadn't seen her since. According to him, she had decided to move to California and start a new life, leaving him and their kids behind. Her parents found Christopher's story hard to believe. First off, they couldn't imagine Melissa abandoning her kids, who were only 1 and 2 years old. Plus, if she had really decided to move, they were sure she would have reached out or visited at some point, but that never happened. Despite their doubts, Christopher stuck to his story, and Melissa's parents couldn't get any more information out of him. They returned home, unsure of what to do next, but determined to find their daughter. Over the next few months, they tried to track her down, reaching out to friends and relatives, but it was as if Melissa had vanished into thin air. In the spring of 1999, Melissa's mother saw a news report about Atlanta police finding a human head in a bag, soaked in bleach, in a wooded area. A few days later, they discovered 4 more bags containing other body parts. What immediately caught her attention was that the site was near Christopher's old job, and she feared the remains could belong to her daughter. However, the police later said that the head belonged to a missing man from another cold case. By early 2000, her parents finally decided to involve the police, but it didn't help much. Investigators spoke with Christopher and concluded that Melissa had likely left her family to start a new life, which is why she hadn't reached out. As a result, the police didn't pursue the case, but Melissa's parents refused to believe that she had just walked away from her old life. In fact, with each passing month, they became more convinced that something bad had happened to her, and they suspected Christopher was involved. Her parents knew the couple had been having serious problems. Christopher had physically abused Melissa several times, leading her to leave him and stay with her parents, bringing the kids along. But every time, he'd apologize and talk her into coming back. This fact only made Christopher's story more suspicious. If he had done everything he could to get her back in the past, why hadn't he done anything this time? He didn't call her parents, didn't go to the police, and made no effort to stop her from leaving. Another odd detail was that, according to Christopher, Melissa hadn't taken anything with her. No clothes, no jewelry, not even her documents. It all seemed incredibly strange, but without help from the police, Melissa's parents felt powerless to do anything about it. For the next few years, there was still no sign of Melissa. But, in 2003, everything changed, and in the most shocking way. Police were investigating the murder of a woman from back in 1977. The case had been cold for 26 years, but it was recently reopened. After reviewing the evidence and running a DNA test, detectives identified the killer. It was Carl Patton, Melissa's father. But that was just the beginning. Once police arrested him, Carl offered them a deal. He agreed to confess to 3 more murders in exchange for full immunity for his wife, who had helped him with the killings. As part of the deal, Melissa's mother also agreed to testify against her husband, and eventually she was granted immunity. According to their confessions, in December 1977, a woman named Mary, who was close to Carl, offered him $15,000 to kill her husband. The reason? Her husband had been cheating on her, plus Mary had taken out life insurance on him and wanted to cash in. Carl agreed, and brought in a friend to help carry out the murder. However, when they approached the man, his lover was with him, so they decided to kill her too. They dumped the woman's body in a river and left the man's body in his car on train tracks, hoping to make it look like an accident. A month later, Carl told his wife that his partner had apparently blabbed about the crime to his girlfriend, and now he wanted to take care of. Carl invited the couple to his home, killed them, and with his wife's help, disposed of the bodies by throwing them into a river. She also helped him clean the crime scene and the van they had used to transport the bodies. Later, Carl confessed to a 5th murder that took place 5 years before the others. It was again Mary who had offered him money, this time to kill her first husband, and Carl agreed. As a result, Carl was charged with 5 murders, and the police immediately suspected him in Melissa's disappearance. But Carl insisted he would never harm his daughter and had nothing to do with it. Upon further investigation, detectives concluded that Carl was probably telling the truth. Initially, they had only suspected him of 1 murder, but he voluntarily confessed to 4 more. Carl claimed he deeply regretted his actions, and it was this remorse that drove him to confess. But that wasn't all. Seizing the moment, Carl decided to ask for a favor. He requested a meeting with the lead detective who had tied him to the murder and said, "You managed to catch me, so maybe you can find my daughter." The detective was intrigued by the whole situation. Here was a man who had committed 5 murders, now asking him to investigate his daughter's disappearance. It was an unusual situation, to put it lightly, and the detective agreed to look into it. He began reviewing the limited information about Melissa's disappearance and quickly noticed one specific detail: those bags of human remains found near Christopher's workplace 4 years earlier. At the time, police had assumed the remains belonged to a man, but the detective discovered that this assumption wasn't based on forensic evidence, just a guess. Given the fact that the remains were found in an advanced state of decomposition, he decided to have them re-examined and ordered a DNA test, as he already had Carl's DNA on file. The results confirmed his suspicion: the remains didn't belong to a man, they belonged to Melissa. After this breakthrough, police finally established that Melissa had been dead for several years, not missing, and her case was officially reclassified as a homicide. According to the medical examiner's report, the victim's body had been dismembered using a reciprocating electric saw. Melissa's torso was never found, which was quite odd. The police conducted multiple searches in the wooded area where the other remains were found, but still couldn't locate it. Despite this, investigators uncovered one interesting lead. They began looking deeper into Christopher and interviewed his former employer at the glass factory where he had worked until Melissa's disappearance. It turned out that Christopher had been fired around the same time for allegedly stealing an electric saw of the same type used to dismember Melissa's body. Melissa's mother also revealed to the police that Christopher had a history of physically abusing her daughter. On top of that, he had a criminal record. Another suspicious detail was that Christopher had changed his name almost immediately after Melissa's death, with no clear reason for doing so. All of this made Christopher the prime suspect in her murder, but the police had no hard evidence against him. They interviewed him multiple times, but he stuck to his original story, although he frequently changed certain details. During one conversation, Christopher claimed Melissa had a lover and ran away with him. Later, he stated that she wanted to sell fake IDs, which explained why she hadn't contacted anyone. The police also uncovered another interesting fact. Shortly after moving from their house, Christopher left his children to live with his parents and hardly ever played a role in their lives since then. He visited them sometimes, but the children didn't even understand that he was their father. But, unfortunately, none of this brought the investigators closer to an arrest because they needed some solid evidence. They obtained a warrant to search the house where Melissa had lived at the time of her death. Given that the killer had used an electric saw, detectives believed the murder likely took place in that house, and they hoped to find blood traces or other evidence. Forensic experts meticulously examined every inch of the house, taking samples from the floor and other surfaces. Unfortunately, their analysis yielded no results. The forensic technology of the time was far less advanced than it is today, leaving the detectives with no choice but to store the collected materials in the evidence warehouse, hoping that one day they might prove useful. The detectives made several more attempts to find new leads and get Christopher to talk, but each effort came up empty. The case eventually went cold again for many years. Meanwhile, Melissa's father was convicted and sentenced to 5 life terms plus 20 years in prison. It's worth noting that Mary, the woman who had paid him for 2 of the murders, had passed away in the late 80s, so she never faced any punishment for her role. Melissa's mother and her older sister continued trying to push the investigation forward on their own. They worked to keep the case in the media spotlight and stayed in regular contact with the detectives, but their efforts didn't yield any progress. This continued until 2017, and Melissa's mother never gave up hope of finding justice for her daughter. That year, she decided to attend an event where true crime enthusiasts gathered to discuss cold cases and search for new leads. One of the attendees was a crime analyst named Cheryl McCullum, and Melissa's mother decided to ask her for help. She shared the story of her daughter's disappearance and added something that immediately caught Cheryl off guard. The woman said, "My husband committed 5 murders, and I helped him." Cheryl became intrigued by the case and, after the event, she began to dig into it thoroughly. She spoke with Melissa's family and even kept in contact with her father, who was serving time in prison. What struck Cheryl the most was how a man who had committed 5 murders seemed more concerned that his daughter's murder would never be solved. Over the next few years, Cheryl collected all the available information on the case and came to the conclusion that the most obvious suspect was Melissa's husband, Christopher. Although there was no direct evidence against him, the overwhelming amount of circumstantial evidence left little doubt. He had a history of domestic violence against Melissa, made no effort to find her after she disappeared, and simply moved on with his life as if nothing had happened. But the most incriminating detail was the fact that, shortly before Melissa's death, Christopher had been accused by his employer of stealing the exact type of saw used to dismember her body. No one in Melissa's family doubted Christopher's guilt, including her children. By the time Cheryl became interested in the case, they had grown up and also tried to help her solve it. Cheryl also consulted some prominent figures in the true crime community, including journalist Nancy Grace and several law enforcement officials. After reviewing all the material she had gathered, they all agreed Christopher was the most likely suspect. Despite this, there wasn't a single undeniable piece of evidence against him, and the case remained at a standstill. At that point, Nancy Grace suggested that Cheryl start her own podcast to draw more attention to the case. Publicity can often become a crucial factor in unsolved cases. It might attract new witnesses who might not realize the significance of the information they hold, potentially changing the course of the investigation. Eventually, Cheryl decided to launch the podcast, and in 2023, she released the first episode about Melissa's case. Since then, she has recorded numerous episodes featuring the victim's mother and other relatives. Cheryl presented all the information she had gathered over the years, yet there was still no progress in the case. This continued until April 2024, when the long-awaited breakthrough in the case finally happened. After she published another episode, a witness reached out to Cheryl stating that he had stumbled upon the podcast and might have valuable information. This individual shared that just before Melissa's disappearance, he witnessed a serious argument between her and Christopher. The details of his account remain unknown, as it all took place only a few months prior and detectives chose not to disclose this information for the sake of the investigation. According to some sources, it seems that during this argument, Christopher allegedly threatened Melissa, and Cheryl passed his story on to the police. This became a turning point, prompting investigators to reopen the case. Over the next 3 months, police reviewed the case materials, interviewed everyone involved, and examined the evidence using modern technology. Experts analyzed the bags containing the remains, along with various samples from Christopher and Melissa's home, where the murder apparently took place. In August 2024, investigators held a press conference to announce that, 25 years after Melissa's death, her husband had finally been arrested. As with the witness testimony, police did not disclose specific details about the evidence they discovered during the renewed investigation. Some sources suggest that modern analysis tools may have uncovered DNA traces or other substantial evidence confirming Christopher's involvement in the murder. The reason detectives are withholding details is fairly standard. The more information is available before the trial, the greater the chances that the defense can use it to their advantage and find ways to challenge the evidence. Currently, Christopher is in jail awaiting trial, and a preliminary hearing where he will plead either guilty or not guilty has yet to take place. Melissa's relatives have little doubt that he will evade justice, and neither do the investigators. It seems they have indeed uncovered serious evidence that will be extremely difficult to dispute. At this moment, the case is drawing closer to its conclusion, though it has taken nearly 26 years. Melissa's story has spread across the country as its details are truly astonishing. Initially, police were able to confirm that the victim was no longer alive only because her father had been arrested for 5 murders and asked investigators for help. Then, the podcast played a crucial role in attracting the witness whose testimony led to the reopening of the investigation and ultimately Christopher's arrest. As for Melissa's children, they also believe in their father's guilt and hope that justice will prevail soon. Besides waiting for a guilty verdict, they want to learn the full truth and Christopher's motives, but that will only be possible if he confesses. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section and don't forget to press the like button if you enjoyed my video.